Hey, everybody, and welcome to the Power of Process, the latest in our series of webinars here at Beer 30, talking about all the ways that you can treat your brewery more like a business and, honestly, sell more beer. That's what we're all here to do in the first place. My name is Aaron Gore. I'm the Vice President of Sales and Marketing here at Beer 30, but I am joined today by a special guest and someone who you guys are probably familiar with if you've ever been to a conference and seen any of our booths. He's pretty visible around the beer scene. I'm happy to welcome my friend and colleague, PK Agrawal, the founder and CEO here at Beer 30. PK, how you doing today, sir?
What's up, Aaron? Hey, everyone. Great to be on the webinar today. As most of you know, I started this business about 8 years ago now, and it's been really cool to see where the Beer 30 brand has gone. At this point, we work with close to 500 breweries of all different sizes across 20 plus countries. So, really just focus on whatever we can do to help breweries brew more, brew better, and really focus in on how we actually use the data to do something more powerful rather than just have it sit in on a bunch of spreadsheets and paper logs and whiteboards and actually have it all inclusive and all tied in with making a big difference in a brewery.
Excellent. And that's exactly what we're going to be talking about today. Because today we're really going to be talking about the ways that you can use the information you already have or should have available to you to make small incremental changes, whether it's to process, approach, or strategy, and really use that as an opportunity to just make your business a little more effective, a little more efficient, and again, sell more beer. And all that's really going to come down to the data that you do have available. So we do want everybody watching this, regardless of if you're Beer 30 customers or if you're using some sort of other platform, to still come away with stuff that's actionable, stuff that you can actually use. We will be using Beer 30 and some of its suite of features for demonstration purposes, but I do hope that everybody on here, even if you do decide to stick with spreadsheets or whatever in-house processes you may have, to still feel comfortable being able to get something out of all this. But with that in mind, PK, I'd love to talk a little about data for the brewery as a whole, because I know for a lot of breweries, you mentioned it before, they are on spreadsheets, they are on disparate processes, they don't really have the ability to get a bird's eye view of what's actually happening within their business. And for a lot of them, that means that what they're really doing is working off of their gut. They're working off of some insights and some assumptions, and frankly, some experience, all of which are valuable, but all of which are also prone to the same kind of biases, same kind of judgment errors, even the same kind of lacking information that all of us are prone to. And when you're making decisions based on your gut, you're the one who has to actually eat the consequences. So I would love to talk a little bit about some of the key, just core metrics, high level, that a brewery really needs to be able to monitor and keep their eye on just to be operationally functional.
That's great, Aaron. Yeah, the way I think about it is at the end of the day, you need to understand what's happening from a sales perspective. You could make the best beer in the world, but if you can't sell it, you're probably not going to go anywhere. Understanding where it is from a cost perspective and understanding how much it's costing to make that beer. I've heard stories about people having an amazing barrel aged, very ingredient rich beer. And at the same time, when you actually break that down on a per barrel amount, being able to make sure that you sell that, including all of the ingredients, wall labor, and everything else, is very critical. So knowing your COGS becomes a second key component of this. And really, the third one is understanding what's happening from a quality and efficiency side, right? If you're in a position where if you start off with 10 barrels, but you're only wrapping up with about 5 barrels in packaging, that's a 50% loss. That's really ineffective and actually has a huge impact on efficiency numbers. It could indicate some aspects of quality. So at the end of the day, based on where we are as an industry, it's a spot where competition is so fierce. And the breweries that succeed are the ones that are able to optimize what's going on from a sales perspective and revenue perspective, COGS perspective, and really from a quality and efficiency perspective.
Now, when you say quality, one of the things that I think a lot of people mistake is, how good your beer tastes, and that's critical. These days, that's the cost of entry. That's table stakes. And when you say quality, tell me a little more about what you mean around that. Do you mean something along those lines, or is it a lot more about just making sure that you have beer that's going to be representative of its intention and is going to be something that's sellable and matches the quality that you have in mind?
Yeah, pretty much. I think it's fair to say that at this point, if you have a customer come through the door and if they have a bad experience with some of your beers, chances are they're probably not coming back because there's probably another brewery literally a couple blocks, a couple miles down the road, right? In all intents and purposes, for most people listening to this and most breweries out there. So when we really start looking at it from a quality perspective, it goes into understanding what's happening from a tolerance perspective. Like if you have a final ABV, final ABU, final ABV, final IBU, how far off you are from it, or even throughout the process. Imagine if on day two or day three, when you're looking at fermentation profiles or pH curves, you're actually not hitting the targets that you have in your recipe. That's a really good indicator to be very proactive on day two or three and modify what's happening in fermentation. The last thing you want is to not be on top of that in any system that you're using and all of a sudden be 13, 14, 15 days down the road and then have to dump the beer because the opportunity cost of the beer sitting in the tank without it being actually utilized later on is very, very high. It's almost double when you actually look at the opportunity cost of the beer that was destroyed versus the beer that you could have added in proactively after day two or three of knowing something was within spec. And then the other thing that I always like telling people is start setting up different sensory panels, right? Like you want your team, you want your brewer, you want your tap room team members, you want your overall company employees all feeling excited when they drink a core brand of beer that it is true to brand, true to mouthfeel, true to taste, and really being able to have those sensory panels goes a really long way to understand just how you're trending from a quality perspective.
Well, and that's one of the amazing things about this industry is that a lot of people outside of it, I'm sure we've all heard this, everybody watching, that, oh, you're in the beer industry. All you do is drink beer all day. And it's like, well, no, but yeah. So,
Yes.
being able to do those sensory panels, that's your Mark One, human tongue. That's the most powerful tool you have for really getting a sense of what these products are going to look like. But no one's infallible. So having those panels running and having as many aggregate opinions that you can use to make sure that you're getting consistency over time is just absolutely key. But one thing that I got from pretty much everything that you said, PK, was the importance of really being able to see some of these things early. That way, you're able to remediate them early before it's either too late or you've wasted a lot of time on something that's just not going to be remediable. So, talk to me a little bit about the sales side. And that's something that, I know, for example, we have our sales summary in our command center on Beer 30, which I think would be an excellent thing to use just as an example of being able to spot trends early and using that as an opportunity to get ahead of challenges or get ahead of opportunities, even on the sales side that may otherwise be missed until you're so deep into it, it's hard to take advantage of.
Yeah, for sure. So the way I like to think about it, I'm gonna go ahead and screen share here. So you should be able to see on the screen the Beer 30 dashboard, and we have this latest update called the Command Center. We rolled this out about 2 months ago now, and it's broken up into three main categories: financial reports, operation reports, and inventory reports. In particular, when we're trying to look at it from a proactive sales side, the sales summary is one of my favorite reports that we've come up with that really allows you to start seeing how data is trending week over week, month over month, and actually compare it to previous data as well. So in this example, when you're actually looking at ways to improve and find the opportunities, right out of the gate, we're able to start seeing how different brands of beer are performing, different item types, the can keg bottling breakdown, different groups, but more importantly, even aspects like how my different sales reps are performing versus different companies that I'm selling beer to. And what's really important with this for anybody watching is that in any capacity, in any system you're looking at, the key thing that you want to understand is which of my beers are performing the best, which formats are they performing the best in, and which accounts am I selling them to the most, right? And as you start looking at this, it creates that level of understanding what the opportunity gap is in front of you, and more importantly, having some accountability metrics for your team members, right? Where if you have different sales reps that have different targets, being able to visually start seeing how that's going from a beer perspective becomes a really good way to understand on a weekly basis just how you're trending.
Well, and I love this. And again, whatever system that you're using, shout out to Jeremy Carney of Central Coast Analytics for helping us build these dashboards into Beer 30. But this information, however you're getting at it, is so key because this is what allows you to understand what your biggest levers are. And that's really one of the ways that for anybody who knows a little of my history, I spent 6 years as a full-time consultant on the sales and marketing side for the craft beer industry. And it's really critical to have an understanding not just of what sales you're making, what revenue you're making, what sales are happening, but also what are the things that have the biggest impact on your business. Really get a sense that if you have to lean on something, you have to prioritize something, what does that need to be? Because at the end of the day, the one thing that's never going to scale is going to be you, the individuals. There's only ever going to be so much time, so much money, so many resources. So when you understand the things that are the most important, that allows you to prioritize. And PK, I heard you mention a couple of times the importance of the opportunity cost involved. And that's something I do think is key because I see a lot of people making really big capex investments in their own brew houses these days. They think they're all capped out on their production capacity, and they're really leaning hard to get more tanks, more FVs, more brights. Just really be able to increase their capacity. It's a very expensive operation, especially in an industry where cash is short and in a trade and economic environment where cash is short. So being able to have an understanding about where you're able to squeeze some more effectiveness and frankly more margin out of what you're already doing is always going to be key. Can you speak a little bit about the importance of being able to really max out what you already have versus starting to dive into more capex?
Yeah, for sure. So I think there's really two ways to for everybody to think about this, right? And I'll actually use some of my time when I was at Ballast Point prior to starting the fifth ingredient. A lot of the pieces here really come back to understanding from the data side of just how efficient and how many losses are happening throughout the different tanks or throughout different packaging runs. And so I'll give a concrete example, and I've spoken about this with a couple different breweries in the past. Um, when I was at Ballast Point, there was a point where on the keg line, we were having losses that were upwards of like 8 to 10%, which you can imagine if you're cranking out, a half barrel keg a minute, 60 seconds, and you have two lanes or one lane, that can definitely increase. And that's a lot of loss that's happening at 8 to 10%. And I think back then, back in 2015, 16, the KHS Transmet lines were rated for a 2 to 3% loss, which was the known loss. So that's a pretty big delta. And the way that we were able to really troubleshoot that was doing a lot of root cause analysis to understand that we were pretty much overfilling our kegs. And what that allows you to then start seeing is, okay, well, why were we overfilling our kegs? Oh, well, it turned out to be that there was increased foaming happening. Why was there increased foaming happening? Well, there was a valve for slow and fast flow that was stuck and broken that needed to be replaced. Once we replaced that solenoid in the valve for slow fast flow, it allowed it to actually become in the proper speed so that way it wouldn't overfill the kegs and overfoam. Now, the purpose of all of that is the only way we were able to understand that that was a real issue was that as a process engineer, on a daily basis, we were monitoring our losses and we needed to see what the losses were on bottling, canning, kegging. And so I'll actually get started from that from like a just understanding of the data and visualization side, which is that when you're actually breaking it down on a per batch basis, being able to see the loss at each step is critical. And so, with that, one of my favorite reports that we've done in the command center is actually in the operations side when it comes to batch efficiency. And this really comes and is driven by that idea that once I go from my brewing side into my filter side, I need to know exactly what the loss has been between what knocked out and what was actually deemed as ready to package. And then from the packaging side, understanding what was actually in the tank to what was packaged becomes critical to start breaking things down. And so this is where when we start looking at these percentages, I can then start seeing like, hey, something happened during the Belgian hef over here uh, that resulted in an 18% loss from a filter to package, right? And this gives me the data pieces to start understanding, well, what was different about the Gore-tastic milk stout that had a 4% loss, right? Gore-tastic, a great homage to Mr. Aaron Gore, who's on the call.
Ta-da!
So with this is how we're able to start really breaking down what's happening at each of these different segments. And regardless of what system you're using, being in a position where if somebody were to ask you, hey, where are we at with brew filter package for the last week? What are those percentages looking like for efficiency? Is critical in order to really understand what's happening from the overall system from a process production efficiency side. So I want to stop there for a moment, and then we can talk more about tanks, as that's a whole different beast as well from an efficiency side, but want to get going on the production side and packaging first.
Well, and I do love this as well because it's easy to say ballast point and see these numbers as being these huge impossible numbers, and this is the thing about this. A lot of times, small breweries don't see value in the level of professionalized process that I know that you've been preaching for a long time for the industry. That's been a key conceit of mine for a very long time as well. But here's the thing: for those larger breweries, the Ballast Points of the world, the Sierra Nevadas of the world, yes, the numbers are larger, but the stakes aren't. Because at the end of the day, these small efficiencies, when you're a mom and pop brewery or a brewery selling most of your product over the bar, that's the difference between being able to make payroll at the end of the week. That's the difference between keeping your lights on and maybe having to look for other alternatives out there. So these little things, even if you don't dive as deep into it as replacing an individual solenoid, even if it's just figuring out, hey, where are we losing here? How can we reclaim that 5, 10, 12% margin that we could otherwise be getting on this beer that our customers love? That makes a difference, makes a significant difference. And, these small changes can have huge impacts, especially in aggregate. But speaking of take utilization, this kind of gets kind of some of the core of what I was talking about before is I know a lot of breweries, they really think they're capped out on their total capacity, which is a wonderful problem to have, especially in 2025, is be making as much beer as you can on your system. But I know me as somebody who at one point was running a brewery making almost 25,000 barrels a year on a 10-barrel system. Please don't ask me how we did that. Working people nearly to death was the answer. Being able to find extra capacity, find extra ways of having maximal utilization, that's money in its own way. Because that's money that
Mm-hmm.
doesn't have to go towards new tanks. That's money that doesn't have to go towards even necessarily new labor in some cases. And a lot of times as well, it just becomes a factor of residency time just as much as it is actual input costs. And especially in the age of the craft blogger, we've been told it's the year of the logger for the last decade. To speak a little to the importance of making sure you're getting as much use out of your equipment as possible.
For sure. The way I think about this is that any single day that you have tanks that are sitting empty, that's effectively money that could be invested into beer that could be used for sales.
Mm-hmm.
And prior to anybody purchasing new tanks, you should be at a point where you're at 80, 90, even close to 100% capacity. Because if not, that just means that you actually have room for optimizing what's actually going in the tanks. Now, it can get very complicated to be able to actually understand just what's the percentage of tanks that are being utilized. So, when we were looking at the command center updates and some of the visuals, one of the really interesting ones came into understanding how can we actually showcase the tanks in a very nice graphical manner. We're all people that you can see numbers, or then you can see a table, or then you can see a chart. And we're all people that when you see the chart, it actually ends up making, for most people, a nice click of, aha, that makes sense. I see what's going on. So, as part of the command center update, one of the really cool tools we created was this tank utilization, where what this is showing me is on a tank by tank basis, exactly how many days things have been sitting. And what's brilliant about this is that this is able to show me that even though I'm thinking I'm at max capacity, I'm actually 43% empty when you actually break down what's happening on the FVs and break down what's happening on the bright tank side. And you can see it's very cool to understand, like, hey, we did this particular beer, and then we have these three that are back to back, which is awesome. But there's all these different white gaps that are there in between. Similarly, up here, I was able to get three different knockouts done and maybe about a day in between. While down here, I had them all go back to back as well. So it's areas like that that then help you understand just what the utilization is. And then also planning out, right, what's happening when it comes to the particular beers. Maybe you want three tanks that are corresponding to your three core beers that are constantly churning over and you're constantly blending into it. that's also great, but you also want to make sure that you have full data capture of what beers are getting blended together, because that on its own is a huge quality piece to understand what's happening as the different liquids merge in together. So the only way to understand from a team perspective to say, hey, we're actually not at capacity at all. We have so much more that we can optimize for before we have to put in the capex to get a brand new tank.
No, absolutely. And honestly, I kind of compare trying to do this all in your head without some tool, just to be able to visualize this. It's almost like trying to play Tetris, but you have to keep the position of all the
Hmm.
blocks in your head instead of having it in front of you. It's so for one, I suck at Tetris anyways, but it's a really hard task to do that without being able to see it in front of you. And to your point, in that example, almost half the time tanks were sitting empty. So you have
Hmm.
an enormous amount of potential capacity, and you're never going to be able to completely max it out. I've got no illusions of that. But the closer to that you can get, if it saves you from dropping an extra 15, 25, 50 grand on new equipment, then that's some very, very real savings that can be poured into any other element of the business. And I think that's something we can all agree we all need. But my background's a little more on the sales side. That's obviously where I come from, but to this day. But a lot of times I see breweries treating the production side and the sales side as two entirely separate worlds. And really, what they are is more of a continuum. And one of the things I think, if we can go back to that sales summary we were looking at before, PK, would actually be hugely valuable. Uh, One of the things I think is so critical is that the sales side has to inform what you're doing on the production side. One of the great sins of our industry is we have such incredible artists back in the brew house that a lot of times we let them brew and then we hope to God we can sell it. And you need your brewers to be driving and informing what you're producing, but you also have to be using sales as your feedback loop. That's telling you what's making the biggest impact. So one of the key things that you need to be able to do is see even just not just what beers are selling well, but in what formats they're selling well. Because every as you're have let's say you have a 20 barrel batch coming out, you got to decide what that split's going to be between sixtels, between halves, between cans. If you have multiple formats of cans, that's its own challenge. And being able to see in a format like this exactly which pack types, which formats are going to be most
Yep.
impactful, which are selling the best, in what percentages and ratios, helps avoid having a beer that's selling like hotcakes and you're sitting on a bunch of dead inventory just because you didn't nail the split.
Yep. And what goes even further than that is if you actually look at this from a COGS perspective, being able to take those same particular items and really break down how much it's costing, where this is able to break it down and say how much it's costing on a per keg basis for a particular beer. So even adding on to that becomes really critical. Like, hey, all my Japanese IPA kegs, they're at 34 a keg, and the other ones are different at 248. So it lets you really understand what's going on from a COGS perspective as well as you look at those splits between kegs, cans, bottles, and where the overall breakdown ends up being.
Well, let's talk about COGS for a minute because COGS is near and dear to my heart. It's, in my opinion, probably other than just raw cash flow, in which it heavily influences the single biggest killer of breweries. Anecdote I think I've used on every single webinar so far. Back when I was consulting, I had a client that was doing $4.5 million in revenue and distribution, and they were broke all the time, couldn't figure out why.
Mm,
Well, when I actually sat down and did a full COGS analysis, what we found out was they weren't fully loading COGS and they were working off of historical costing. So they were averaging
mm,
their costs over time on some of their brands. They were even just setting target COGS based on one point in time. Turns out they're losing $1.74 on every single case that went out of their number one selling beer. Made up 40% of their total sales at one SKU. They were winning themselves to death. And so COGS, something absolutely critical to keep your eye on because at the end of the day, that's what impacts your margin. We don't
mm,
have pricing power on the craft brewing side. We're price takers. We're not price setters. And in
yep.
general, we do have to follow the market to a degree. So all we can really control is our own costs. And you know, margin's what goes in the bank, not revenue. So the closer eye that you can keep on those costs, closer eye you can keep on costs across different formats, especially at a time like now where aluminum is all over the map right now, grain is all over the map right now. The earlier you're able to get ahead of some of those cost trends and react to them, respond to them, the better off you're going to be. So one of the key things is just understanding how those input costs are changing. And this is one that you can probably do on pencil and paper, but if you do have any sort of reporting on this, just being able to track historical costs, key for that. PK, I know we have our received raw ingredients and materials reporting, but key thing you need to understand is over any period of time, not only what you're paying right now for it, but what have you historically paid? Because that's a great way of winding up accidentally underwater. And you need to understand just how much of your total costs are coming from individual inputs. You know, maybe cans are a much, much bigger component of your total spend than you realize they are. And if all of a sudden, I don't know, tariffs spike aluminum prices, which is something that's definitely impacted this year. That's something we all need to be aware of and completely agnostic to that situation. That is something that'll impact your business. So being able to get ahead of that early and respond quickly is key. But let's throw another hypothetical out there. PK, would you be able to bring up that raw materials usage report? A nice, beautiful, colorful one that I love so much.
Yeah, for sure. So let's jump right into that.
So let's say, for example, and this is something I wish more breweries would do. However, you're getting to it is having an understanding of what your dependencies are, your actual supply chain vulnerabilities. And this really came to a head for me in 2020 when I, along with a lot of other people, our breweries all of a sudden had to start sourcing cans when they were in short supply. On a lot of cases, on like an almost 2 week basis, finding new suppliers, just try to keep the actual flow going. And you know, understanding how big of an impact any sort of shortages or major price differentials are going to have on your business can be key to understanding your business. So, what I like about this is it puts it all in front of you because I'm a very visual learner. I definitely benefit from some of these data visualization things, just like a lot of our users do. But PK, what we're looking at here, tell me a little about what this report is and kind of what it shows us.
Yeah, so there's effectively three layers in this visualization. The first one is understanding what's happening with the actual ingredient. In this case, we're focused on hops, but you could adjust that for hops, grains, and different ingredients, things like that. You then have the corresponding brand that it ties in with, and also even the brand grouping that takes it a different level, right? Imagine if you have as a brand level just a bunch of different IPAs that you're doing, but you actually want to group together the hazies, the double IPAs, the regular IPAs into different groupings, so that way you can really understand just how that ingredient piece is going. And what's also really powerful about this is that as you actually start looking at each of these different curves and charts and how they're trending, you're able to start really breaking down just where those utilization pieces are going for each particular beer. That way, you know, if let's say Cascade prices go up, that's going to have a huge impact on my brown sugar ale and all these other beers that tie in with Cascade and the corresponding dollar value that's there. So that's at a high level, but open to hearing more from you as well as to how you've seen or how you would use this in your own day to day when you were running different production facilities.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's exactly what I was getting at. So let's say, for example, we know that we're going to be getting hit with a price increase on Cascade, just for examples purposes. Let's say the entire Pacific Northwest was hit with a massive heat wave, the crop went down, and all of a sudden the secondary market is short. Everybody's paying more for Cascade. If you can drill in on Cascade for a minute for me, PK, just to make this really pop. What this is going to do is show you all of the beers that are actually making use of Cascade. So this is going to really give you a sense of, frankly, just how screwed you are if that price spikes through the roof, or if you're seeing
Mm-hmm.
price drops, just how much you stand to gain. So if you're looking at a bunch of beers that are using Cascade, it might make sense to use this as a reference point for leaning on other products or even reformulating products. Let's go ahead and drill out of Cascade and instead drill into brown sugar ale, just to give an illustration of that purpose. This is a beer that someone should be fired for creating the recipe for. You do not need five different freaking hops to get this hop profile, especially on something called brown sugar ale. So this might be an occasion where if Cascade's going up in price, that's a huge cost center for you. This is an occasion to possibly reformulate or iterate. And a lot of breweries just are so fearful of iterating on their products. And I get it. You don't want to change it in a way that's going to impact the way that your customers are receiving it. But so often as we come into this industry, we do come into it with a lot of our bad habits from home brewing. And I've seen brewers who have been doing it for 25, 30, 35 years and still carry a lot of those habits. It's okay to iterate. These are agronomic products. In a lot of cases, you should be iterating just to keep consistency in the first place. So, having an understanding of how you're able to iterate towards consistent quality while still being able to keep costs under control can be absolutely huge. We touch on COGS a few times, and we've obviously been kind of circling around this, but since we're talking about ways that you can really focus on making your business more effective, one thing I want everybody to keep in mind as well is that however you're calculating your COGS, make sure that you're fully loading them, make sure that they're based on your current costs, not just historicals. But the other key thing is don't just fully load your COGS based on the amount of work going into the fermenter. I see that mistake time and time again where people will be dropping 40 barrels of beer into an FV, and they'll be taking all their costs and assuming that there's 40 barrels of beer coming out of that. We live in the era of hazy IPAs. If you get 35 barrels out of that, I'd consider that a win in some cases. And you'll have hop loss, you'll have true loss, transfer loss. You might be taking samples off the grant. You'll have packaging loss, low fills, QC issues. Track that stuff and make sure that you have an actual assessment of what your real costs are, because you might be underwater and not even realize it until you start looking at your bank account at the end of the month. And that can be a real nasty surprise that you don't want to have to deal with.
Yeah, what I always like adding on with that is one of the key things of that analysis is that when you actually look at the cost per barrel or cost per unit, you really want to incorporate what the overall dollar values have been of every single ingredient that have gone into that particular beer, but then actually look at what was the final package there. So as you divide those numbers out, you actually get a very good sense of what the true cost of goods are. And that actually gets me to a really cool point with one of the aspects of batch history and brand history, where just regarding whatever spreadsheet or areas you're looking at, whatever systems you're using, as you come across a particular beer, let's say my brown sugar ale batch 11, what I'm able to then start doing is actually start breaking this down to understand just what's going on from each of the ingredients that went in. So to Aaron's point here, I knocked out 71.6 barrels, but I actually had a filter loss, I had a packaging loss, so I only packaged off 57.53 barrels. That's a pretty big dip, right? Overall, as we're looking at it. So the overall cost for raw materials and packaging supplies then really indicate what's going on a per barrel basis, which then even gets more granular where you can start seeing that I have a 24 pack of bottles at $15.27, cans at 10.93, and half barrels at 92.84. And so with this, you're able to really start understanding just how that tracking is going based on what the actuals are versus targets. And what is even better about this is not only do you need to look at it on a per batch basis, like my batch 11, if I go to something like my brand history, that allows me to actually trend out all the different batch numbers that have ever happened, all the historicals, the ones that are in progress right now, to really understand what those costs per barrels are actually going with. So this becomes a really powerful way to understand just where that's going on a batch by batch, day by day basis, and understand what's happening with raw materials and packaging supplies to get true information of what's going on.
Yeah, and I love the fact that we're looking here at COGS average per barrel as well. One other thing, as we were looking at the brew house utilization as well, the closer you start to approach max capacity in your brew house, the more you need to squeeze every ounce of margin per barrel that you can. That means residency time and margin per barrel become infinitely more important the closer to capacity you are. It really requires a paradigm shift in your thinking. Early on, you can afford to be a little wasteful on tank space, on residency time, even though that is going to throw your cash cycle off. But I do urge everybody that as you start getting close to max capacity in your brew house, unless you start getting new tanks in, those loggers that you're making, anything aged, anything you're throwing in a barrel, those are a lot less profitable than you think they are, because you are parking a
Mm.
whole lot of cash in place for a whole lot of time. And it's also going to have huge opportunity costs on the other stuff that you can be throwing in there. And now that be happy to have a conversation with anybody about what some of those actual numbers look like in your own business offline, but definitely something to keep in mind. PK?
Yeah, and Aaron, I think that's a really good segue. What I'd love to hear from you as well is when you're talking about that forecasting, one of the buzz terms that's in the industry is this whole like bullseye model and really understanding of how those pieces tie in together. Can you explain that a little bit more and kind of with your own experience of how breweries could actually utilize that like bullseye model for forecasting and sales to actually get what it is that they need to actually get out the door?
Absolutely. Forecasting is definitely one of my hobby horses. Idiom I think I've used like three times on this one webinar. But, forecasting is absolutely critical, and not just on the production side. And it is there, but you know, we've been talking a lot about production, talking a lot about the brew house, talking a lot about that, and that's where conceptually a lot of our heart is as an industry. But sales is what actually brings the dollars in, and it is part of that continuum. Your process isn't done. We just looked at cogs. Cogs are valuable, but here's the unspoken thing about cogs is until you actually sell that process, that product rather, everything that you've baked into those cogs is pure cost. It doesn't just become one factor against your margin until it's actually sold. So keeping your inventory risk as low as possible is critical. Now, what do I mean by inventory risk? I'd actually argue that inventory and risk are synonyms because the moment that you make an outlay for raw materials for any particular product, you're making a bet. And the bet that you're making is that at the very least, you're going to be able to sell enough product that you're going to be brewing with those raw materials to break even on what you spent on them. More so, you're making an even bigger bet that compared to all the other places you could be using that money, this is the most efficient use and is going to get you the biggest return in the shortest amount of time. So the more that you're able to avoid parking a lot of cash into just finished goods inventory, just beer that's ready to be sold, that's sitting on the floor, the better off you're going to be. Now, from an inventory management standpoint, what this means is keeping your days on hand of inventory, the amount of inventory, your daily rate of sale that you currently have on hand, as low as possible, with enough hedge to make sure you never miss a purchase order. Usually, somewhere in the 25, 26 day would be kind of that platonic ideal before you start getting into potential missed sales territory. The real key, though, is how you do that, and that's through accurate forecasting. And this starts to your point on the bullseye model, really broad. I know a lot of breweries that they really do just brew it and hope to God they can move it, but you got to start much, much further out, at least six
Sure.
months, with whatever assumptions that you actually have, the things that you actually know about your general velocities historically, but also seasonality, upcoming events, and any of your sales plans, whether it's increasing points of distribution or just really putting some more efforts into the market. Start broad and get that on paper. And that's not to say that you're going to get it right. You're going to be off. The goal is
Sure.
as you go, continue to refine those forecasts, continue to narrow in until you start getting more and more accurate and have more and more information, more and more accurate information about what's upcoming until you start getting preliminary pre-sales, preliminary POs from wholesalers or from accounts, and then you start getting actual POs or sales orders, right before you're actually able to go ahead and take it to market. The goal being that by the time you actually have product touching a tank, you're as close to spot on with what your sales are actually going to be as you possibly can be. And that's what allows you to make sure that you're not parking a huge amount of cash in your cold box and then trying to figure out creative ways to sell it before it codes out, before you have to fire sale it through the tap room or what have you. I mean, I think we've all been in the case where we've had to, buy back product from a wholesaler at some point, and that's incredibly frustrating. And that's real money that you're paying just to save a relationship, which is really the only thing you're doing in that case. So, making sure that you're being extremely mindful and planning out your sales as far out as possible and planning out your production as far out based on that as you can is the quickest way to keep your costs low. Now, a couple of ways that you can do that even within tools, if you have some sort of demand planning tool or material resource planning tool, a couple of things that we have through Beer 30, that's really just designed to take all that information and reconcile that and synthesize that so that you know that you're never going to have insufficient product to meet every sales order you have. And on the raw material side, to make sure that you know exactly when you need to be ordering more grain, more hops, more adjuncts, so that you're never going to be short on the ingredients that you need to actually be producing them. It's called just-in-time manufacturing. It's pretty well through and through discipline throughout most manufacturing, but we don't think of ourselves as a manufacturing business. So a lot of times we just don't pay nearly that close attention to making sure we get those forecasts right and make sure that we're only producing as much as we absolutely need. Otherwise, your costs are actually going to be significantly higher than you think they are because the product going out the door isn't going to be the same volumes that you're actually producing.
That's great. And I think one of the best ways that I like framing that is it's one big optimization problem, right? That's effectively what just-in-time planning ends up being. And so if anybody watching this is in a position where they're just using their spreadsheets, if your spreadsheet's all interconnected and able to then manufacture this and tell you exactly what you need to produce, that's great. If they're not, you need a system. And whether it's Beer 30 or whether it's anything else, any other software, you need something that effectively helps you optimize this. Otherwise, you're in a spot where you are taking different darts at different bullseyes, not even in the same game or the same, mat that's in front of you. So a way that I like to think about that is when you're breaking down this optimization problem, it's effectively three different areas. And you can see from the Beer 30 side here, you start off by looking at, hey, what's my sales forecast going to be? So month over month for the month of June and upcoming, what are we looking at when it comes to the actual number of cans that I'm going to need for my finest lager, for my brown sugar ale, bottles, kegs, etc. Being able to really break this down and understanding really what the velocities need to be on a month by month basis. And hey, maybe it is that come the summer months, a lager is going to be selling a lot more than the stout, which may be more in the winter months. And so being able to understand and accurately predict the sales forecast gets you to see what the team is trying to sell.
And
The Go
anybody
for
who
it.
tells you that they're going to do automatic forecasting for you, do not believe them. That
Mm-hmm.
is one of the things that drives me the most nuts. You can look at your historicals, but the problem is we're in a highly seasonal industry that's very event driven on the small scale. And your goal should always be to add more points of distribution and address some of those gaps that you have in the market. So if you're running purely off historicals, that's one of the quickest ways to do the ultimate sin on forecasting, which is under forecasting. As much
Yep.
as you want to keep your actual inventory as low as possible, it's always better to be slightly over forecasted than under forecasted and miss a sale, especially if you got any grocery store placements, because you have a very, very limited amount of time that that shelf can ever sit empty before you lose that placement on the planogram forever.
Yep, for sure. And so with that, the sales forecast becomes one piece of the equation. The second piece then ends up being the production forecast. So really being able to dive in and understand for each of the beers that's happening on a week by week basis, when is it actually coming out of the tank? How many brews do I actually have to do in a particular week to actually get those particular brews, the overall efficiency numbers out the door, and based on those particular time and tank, understanding when the throughput will actually lead to beer being pushed out the door. And what's really great about this then is you have the sales, you have the beers and what's going into tanks to then put together the actual demand report that shows to you what's going on a per month basis and how you're able to then start trending to understand like, hey, am I actually going to have enough inventory to meet those particular demands? And at what point is it in the month of December in this case that I'm actually running low based on that particular forecast? So this becomes a really good way to have sales, production, and demand understand like, hey, do I even have the capacity to brew and produce that? But then you add another layer onto that, which is material resource planning and the beauty of why they go so hand in hand. Not only do I have those particular brews, do I have the right ingredients on hand to do this? This is indicating to me right now that my flaked oats, I'm going to run out of those next week on June 30th. And I'm actually going to be low, so I need to get those ordered. And so, based on this, it gives me the understanding of what needs to be brewed by what particular date based on lead times. So that way, I'm not in the hole when it comes to actually pulling that recipe. Because the last thing you want to do is have to overnight hops or grains from a distribution center miles or states away kind of thing and have to pay overnight freight charges, or else your entire schedule is massively messed up for what's going out the door.
Or going and having to buy a flat pack of yeast from your local homebrew shop, because I see all of you. You've all done it. We've all been there. And yeah, some of this is stuff that you can track manually. And if that works for you in your business, then I encourage you to do it until it becomes onerous. But the one thing I try to tell people is, I've mentioned it before. The only thing that doesn't scale is you. And, again, anecdote from when I was a consultant, at a brewery who we were talking to, and talking to the owner. He's sitting there with his laptop, and he said,
Yeah.
I got into this because I wanted to brew beer. I wanted to be able to share it across the bar with customers and be able to really create an experience for everybody and focus on just making great stuff and sharing it with people. And instead, and he turned his computer around, and he said, instead, I'm booking freaking yoga. And that's the nature of this business. We have to wear so
Hmm.
many different hats that you're always going to be pulled in so many different directions and doing
Sure.
things that are completely unrelated to why you got into this to begin with. So, whatever aspects, and this goes for the front of house as well, this goes from field sales, this goes to every aspect of running a business. Automate what you can because it's still going to be cheaper than hiring people to do it for you, and your time does have value. I know it's easy for it not to feel that way. I know how isolating this industry can be, how strung out all of us have been in this industry, but your time does have value even beyond just what it should have. It even keeps you away from doing things that are important if they're not just urgent. So focus on getting help, focus on getting tools, and focus on utilizing them in ways that let you run a more effective business, one that doesn't just keep the lights on, but actually thrives because it's not just even about you. It's about everyone who works for you. It's about your whole team. It's about the customers who really value you, your community that really values you and everything that you bring. And that's one of the things I love about this industry, but it is very easy to lose sight of when, you get so deep in the weeds that you can't come back up for air. But with that in mind, just a handful of things that we want people to be able to keep in mind as we're looking at ways to just increase the effectiveness, increase the efficiency of what you're doing throughout your business. I'm sure that you have stories from within your own about ways that you've been able to really lean not just on tools, but on processes, on outreach in order to do so. So please go ahead and drop those in the comments. If you're not dropping them in there, though, reach out to us. We love to hear them. Might even spark ideas for future webinars. And I really do hope everybody tuning in was able to get some valuable stuff out of this. Definitely also visit us next month on July 23rd at 3 p.m. Eastern. Our next webinar is actually going to be with three members of the cannabis beverage industry. We're going to be talking about cannabis, some of the challenges thereof, some of the opportunities that exist, and ways to really be able to, if not lean in on it, at least understand that industry enough to understand how it's going to impact craft beer as a whole. I really hope to see you there. PK, thank you so much for being on here. Always great having you on, always great insights. Thank you, everybody, and cheers.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone. Cheers. Have a great one.